In the heart of 17th century Spain, a queen stood at the precipice of a crumbling empire, her life a tapestry of duty, tragedy, and whispered curses. Mariana of Austria, a woman thrust into a foreign court at the tender age of 14, would become the mother of a king so frail, so plagued by misfortune, that history would brand him as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Her story is not just one of regal splendor, but of a desperate struggle to hold together a dynasty teetering on the edge of collapse, under the weight of inbreeding, political machinations, and a child whose very existence seemed to defy the will of God. As we unravel Mariana's life, we step into a world of gilded cages and shadowed corridors, where every decision bore the weight of an empire's survival end, where a mother's love could not shield her son from a fate that would haunt Spain for generations. To understand Mariana of Austria, we must first paint the backdrop of her world of Spain at the zenith of its power, yet already showing the cracks of decline. Born in 1634 in Vienna, Mariana was a Habsburg princess, daughter of Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand III and Maria Anna of Spain. The Habsburgs, a dynasty that ruled vast swathes of Europe through strategic marriages, were notorious for their intermarriages, a practice meant to consolidate power but which sowed the seeds of genetic ruin. Spain, under the rule of Philip IV, Mariana's uncle and future husband, was the colossus of the age, its territory spanning from the Americas to the Philippines. Yet, by the mid-17th century, the empire was bleeding drained by endless wars, economic mismanagement, and the devastating 30 Years' War. The Spanish court, centered in the imposing Alcazar of Madrid, was a labyrinth of intrigue, where nobles vied for influence, and the Catholic Church cast a long, unyielding shadow over every aspect of life. Mariana's journey to Spain began with a marriage alliance, a common fate for royal women of her time. In 1649, at just 14 years old, she wed Philip IV, who was 44 and already twice widowed. This union was not born of romance but of cold, calculated necessity to strengthen ties between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family and ensure the continuation of their bloodline. Philip, a man burdened by the weight of his crown and personal losses, including the death of his beloved first wife and only son, saw in Mariana a vessel for hope, a means to secure an heir. But the young queen, pale and delicate, with the wide-eyed innocence of a girl far from home, stepped into a court that was as much a battlefield as any war-torn frontier. She was a foreigner in a land of rigid traditions, her every move scrutinized by courtiers who whispered of her Austrian manners and questioned her ability to bear the weight of Spain's expectations. The marriage, though politically sound, was steeped in the troubling reality of Habsburg inbreeding. Mariana and Philip were not just uncle and niece but shared multiple common ancestors, a web of familial ties so tangled that it would later manifest in the tragic health of their offspring. Yet, at the time, such concerns were secondary to the urgent need for a male heir. Philip's only surviving child from his first marriage, Maria Teresa, could not inherit the throne under Spanish law, and the pressure on Mariana to produce a son was immense. Her early years as queen were marked by a string of pregnancies, many of which ended in heartbreak stillbirths and infants who did not survive their first fragile months. Each loss deepened the gloom over the court, fueling rumors of divine displeasure or even curses upon the royal house. Mariana, though young, bore these burdens with a quiet stoicism, her faith and sense of duty anchoring her amidst the storm of grief. In 1661, after years of sorrow, a flicker of hope emerged with the birth of Charles, a boy who would become the long-awaited heir to the Spanish throne. But even in his infancy, there were signs that all was not well. Charles was frail, his tiny body racked by ailments that baffled the court physicians. Whispers began to circulate. Some spoke of a curse, others of the sins of the Habsburgs coming to fruition. Mariana, now a mother, poured her heart into protecting her son, unaware that she was nurturing a king whose reign would be marked by such profound weakness that it would signal the end of an era. Her role as queen consort was evolving into something far more complex: a regent, a protector, and ultimately, a woman caught in the crosshairs of history's cruelest ironies. As we delve deeper into Mariana's story, we will see how her life became a battleground of political intrigue and personal sacrifice. Her marriage to Philip IV, though initially a union of necessity, placed her at the center of a dynasty's desperate fight for survival. The birth of Charles, while a moment of triumph, was only the beginning of a long, torturous journey. Spain's golden age was fading, and Mariana, with her foreign roots and untested resolve, would soon find herself navigating a court rife with betrayal and ambition. How did this young queen, so far from the comforts of Vienna, rise to meet the challenges of a crumbling empire? And what forces human or otherwise conspired to shape her son into the most cursed king in Spanish history? As the heavy doors of the Alcazar of Madrid closed behind Mariana of Austria, the weight of her new reality settled like a shroud. The young queen, barely past her teenage years, found herself not just a consort but a pawn in a high-stakes game of power, where every smile hid a dagger and every alliance masked a betrayal. The Spanish court of the mid-17th century was a viper's nest, and Mariana, with her Austrian accent and unfamiliar customs, was an easy target for those who sought to undermine her influence. Her marriage to Philip IV had secured her position, but it had also painted a target on her back, as nobles and advisors jostled for control over the king and over the future of Spain itself. The birth of Charles in 1661, though a moment of fleeting joy, only intensified the storm brewing around her. As the court's factions turned their gaze to the frail infant who represented both hope and vulnerability for the Habsburg dynasty, Philip IV, though a king of immense power, was a man worn down by decades of rule and personal loss. His reign had seen Spain's fortunes wane defeats in the 30 Years' War, the loss of Portugal in 1640, and a treasury bled dry by endless conflicts. He leaned heavily on his advisors, particularly the powerful Count-Duke of Olivares in earlier years, though by the time of Charles's birth, new figures had risen to prominence. Among them was Don Juan José of Austria, Philip's illegitimate son from an earlier affair, a charismatic and ambitious man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Don Juan José, though barred from the throne, harbored dreams of influence, and his presence cast a long shadow over Mariana. As a foreigner and a woman, her authority was perpetually questioned, and Don Juan José, with his Spanish blood and military prowess, became a rallying point for those who distrusted her. Whispers of her inability to understand Spain's needs grew louder, and courtiers began to sow seeds of discord, suggesting that the Queen's Austrian loyalties might conflict with Spain's interests. Mariana's personal struggles only fueled the court's intrigue. Her early years as queen had been marked by the devastating loss of several children, each miscarriage or infant death, a public wound that eroded confidence in her ability to secure the dynasty. When Charles was born on the 6th of November, 1661, the court held its breath, praying for a robust heir, but those hopes were quickly dashed. The infant was sickly from the start, his small frame prone to seizures and fevers that left physicians scrambling for answers. The Habsburg tradition of intermarriage, meant to preserve power, had backfired catastrophically. Charles's parents were uncle and niece, and his genetic lineage was a tangled web of repeated unions among close relatives. Though the science of genetics was unknown at the time, the court could not ignore the visible consequences. A child who struggled to nurse, whose head seemed too large for his body, and whose survival seemed a daily miracle. Mariana, fiercely protective, kept him close, but her maternal devotion could not silence the murmurs that this boy was cursed, a living symbol of divine judgment on the Habsburgs' hubris. The political tension surrounding Charles's birth was compounded by Spain's precarious position on the European stage. France, under the ambitious Louis XIV, eyed Spanish territories with hunger, particularly the Netherlands and parts of Italy, still under Habsburg control. Mariana's own niece, Maria Theresa, Charles's half-sister, had married Louis XIV in 1660 as part of a peace treaty, but this alliance did little to quell French aggression. Instead, it placed Mariana in an awkward position torn between her Austrian family ties, her Spanish duties, and the looming threat of a French king who saw weakness in Spain's new heir. Courtiers loyal to France whispered in the shadows, suggesting that Mariana's foreign blood made her a liability, while others accused her of favoring Habsburg interests over Spain's. Every decision she made, from the appointment of tutors for Charles to her interactions with foreign ambassadors, was dissected for signs of disloyalty, turning even her smallest actions into potential scandals. As Charles Grewar, struggled to grow, Mariana faced another layer of conflict, the question of regency and succession. Philip IV, now in his late 50s, was visibly declining, his health battered by years of stress and melancholy. The court buzzed with speculation about what would happen if the king died before Charles reached maturity. Under Spanish law, a regent would be needed, and Mariana as the queen mother was the natural choice. But her youth, her foreign origins, and her perceived inexperience made her a controversial figure for such a role. Don Juan José, ever the opportunist, positioned himself as an alternative, rallying nobles who feared a woman's rule during a time of crisis. The clergy, too, wielded immense influence, often siding with whoever promised to uphold Catholic orthodoxy most fervently. Mariana, devout as she was, found herself navigating a delicate balance, proving her loyalty to Spain while fending off accusations that her Austrian upbringing made her unfit to guide the empire through turbulent times. Through it all, Mariana clung to her faith and her duty, her days spent in prayer and in the nursery, watching over a son whose every breath seemed a battle. Yet the walls of the Alcazar offered no sanctuary from the growing storm. The court's factions sharpened their knives, waiting for Philip's inevitable passing to make their move. Spain's enemies abroad licked their lips, sensing opportunity in a kingdom led by a fragile child and a contested queen. And in the quiet moments, as Mariana gazed at Charles's pale face, she must have wondered if the whispers of a curse were true of her son. Her hope was doomed to bear the weight of a dynasty's sins. How would she protect him in a world so eager to tear them both apart? And what would happen when the king, her only shield, was no longer there to stand between her and the wolves at the gate? The year 1665 marked a turning point for Mariana of Austria, a moment when the gilded cage of her queenship tightened into a suffocating prison of responsibility and grief. On the 17th of September, King Philip IV, her husband and uncle, drew his last breath in the Alcazar of Madrid, leaving behind a fractured empire and a 4-year-old heir too frail to even walk unaided. Mariana, at just 30 years old, was thrust into the role of regent for her son, Charles II, now King of Spain and its vast dominions. But this was no mere ceremonial title. It was a burden that would test her resolve to its breaking point. Surrounded by enemies within and without, Mariana found herself imprisoned by the very crown she served, her every move watched by a court that doubted her, while her heart ached for a child whose body and mind seemed to crumble under the weight of his destiny. As regent, Mariana was tasked with governing a Spain that was a shadow of its former glory. The treasury was depleted, the military overstretched, and the empire's territories were under constant threat from France, England, and the rising Dutch Republic. Her son's ascension as Charles II should have been a moment of unity, but instead, it exposed the deep fissures within the Spanish court. The will of Philip IV had named Mariana as regent until Charles reached the age of 14, but this decision was met with immediate resistance. Don Juan José of Austria, Philip's illegitimate son and a perennial thorn in Mariana's side, rallied a faction of nobles who argued that a woman, and a foreign one at that, could not be trusted to steer Spain through such perilous times. His charisma and military background made him a formidable opponent, and he openly challenged Mariana's authority, accusing her of prioritizing Austrian Habsburg interests over Spain's needs. Every council meeting became a battlefield, with Mariana forced to defend her decisions against a chorus of skepticism, her voice often drowned out by men who saw her as little more than a placeholder. Beyond the political imprisonment of her regency, Mariana faced a far more personal torment: the relentless decline of Charles's health. The young king, whose survival had once seemed a miracle, grew into a child whose every day was a struggle. By the age of 5, he could barely speak, his words slurred and halting, and his physical deformities became more pronounced: a protruding jaw, an oversized tongue, and a body so weak that he could not stand for long without support. Court physicians, steeped in the limited medical knowledge of the time, offered little beyond prayers and ineffective remedies, bleeding him or prescribing concoctions that only seemed to worsen his condition. Mariana, ever the devoted mother, refused to accept their grim prognoses, seeking out healers and even turning to religious relics in the hope of divine intervention. She kept Charles close, often carrying him herself through the cavernous halls of the palace, as if her touch alone could shield him from the curse that seemed to cling to his very being. The whispers of El Hechizado the Bewitched grew louder during these years, fueled by Charles's alarming frailty and the court's penchant for superstition. Many believed that the boy's condition was not merely the result of inbreeding, though the Habsburgs' tangled family tree was no secret, but rather a sign of supernatural malice. Some pointed fingers at Mariana herself, suggesting that her foreign blood had brought a curse upon the royal house, while others spoke of witchcraft or demonic possession. Exorcisms were performed in secret, priests muttering incantations over the trembling child as Mariana watched, torn between faith and despair. These rituals, though born of desperation, only deepened the sense of doom that hung over the court, turning Charles into a figure of pity and fear, a king who inspired not loyalty but dread. For Mariana, each whispered rumor was a dagger to the heart, a reminder that her son, the hope of Spain, was seen by many as a living omen of collapse. Mariana's regency was further complicated by the external pressures bearing down on Spain. Louis XIV of France, ever the opportunist, saw Charles's weakness as an invitation to press his claims on Spanish territories. The War of Devolution, erupting in 1667, saw French forces invade the Spanish Netherlands, exploiting Spain's inability to mount a strong defense. Mariana, advised by a council rife with infighting, struggled to respond, her decisions often undermined by nobles who prioritized personal gain over national interest. Letters from her Austrian relatives urged her to seek alliances with the Holy Roman Empire, but such moves only fueled accusations of divided loyalties. She was trapped in a web of impossible choice-severy alliance, risked alienating a faction. Every military expenditure drained an already empty treasury, and every defeat on the battlefield was laid at her feet. The regent, once a young bride full of quiet determination, began to show the strain of her position, her face etched with lines of worry, her nights haunted by the fear of losing both her son and the empire he was meant to rule. Through it all, Mariana's love for Charles remained her anchor, even as it imprisoned her in a cycle of hope and heartbreak. She surrounded him with the best care she could muster, appointing loyal tutors and companions in a vain attempt to nurture his mind and body. Yet, as the years dragged on, it became painfully clear that Charles would never be the king Spain needed. His intellectual disabilities, coupled with his physical ailments, meant that even the simplest tasks of governance would be beyond him. Mariana, though she could not admit it aloud, must have felt the crushing weight of this truth, a mother's dream of her child's future shattered by the harsh reality of his condition. The Alcazar, with its cold stone walls and endless corridors, became a prison not just of politics, but of unrelenting sorrow, as Mariana watched her son fade before her eyes, knowing that neither her power nor her prayers could save him from his fate. By the late 1670s, the air in the Alcazar of Madrid was thick with despair, a palpable weight that clung to every tapestry and echoed through every hall. Mariana of Austria, now in her 40s, had spent over a decade as regent, her life a relentless battle to protect her son, Charles II, and preserve the crumbling edifice of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. But the boy king, now a teenager, was no closer to embodying the strength Spain so desperately needed. His body, ravaged by the genetic toll of centuries of inbreeding, was a frail shell, his jaw so malformed he could barely eat, his legs so weak he often needed to be carried, and his mind so clouded that coherent thought seemed an impossible dream. For Mariana, every day was a crucible, her heart torn between a mother's unyielding love and the stark realization that her son, the last hope of a once mighty empire, was slipping away before her eyes. This was the climax of her tragedy, a moment of profound crisis, where personal grief collided with the fate of a nation. Charles II, officially king since the age of 4, reached the age of majority in 1675 at 14, marking the formal end of Mariana's regency. Yet, this milestone was a hollow victory. The court had hoped that adulthood might bring some miraculous improvement, that the young king might defy the grim predictions of his childhood. Instead, his condition only worsened. His physical deformities became more pronounced, earning him cruel nicknames among the courtiers who dared not speak them aloud in Mariana's presence. His Habsburg jaw, a grotesque exaggeration of the family's signature trait, made chewing a torturous ordeal, often leaving him malnourished and prone to infections. Seizures plagued him with increasing frequency, each episode leaving him weaker, his eyes vacant as if some unseen force had stolen a piece of his soul. Physicians, powerless against ailments they could neither name nor cure, resorted to ever more desperate measures, bleeding, purging, and even concoctions laced with mercury, which only hastened his decline. Mariana, who had once clung to every shred of hope, now watched these treatments with a hollow gaze, knowing they were as much theater as medicine, a futile dance to delay the inevitable. The crisis deepened as Charles's inability to rule became undeniable. Though he was king in name, his intellectual disabilities meant that even the simplest matters of state were beyond his grasp. He could not read or write with proficiency, and his speech, when it came at all, was a labored mumble that few could decipher. Courtiers and advisers, once content to bide their time under Mariana's regency, now scrambled for power, exploiting the vacuum left by a monarch who could not govern. Don Juan José of Austria, Mariana's longtime rival, seized his moment, orchestrating a coup of influence in 1677. With the support of disgruntled nobles and a populace weary of foreign influence, he forced Mariana into a form of political exile, banishing her from Madrid to Toledo. This was a devastating blow, a public humiliation for a woman who had sacrificed everything for Spain. Stripped of her role as the guiding hand behind the throne, Mariana was left to watch from afar as her son, barely capable of understanding his own plight, was manipulated by men who cared little for his well-being and everything for their own gain. Yet, even in exile, Mariana's torment was far from over. Reports of Charles's condition reached her in Toledo, each letter a fresh wound. The king, now in his late teens, was married in 1679 to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess chosen in a desperate bid to secure an heir and strengthen alliances against France's ambitions. But this union, meant to be a beacon of hope, became a tragic farce. Charles, physically and mentally incapable of fulfilling the duties of a husband, left the marriage unconsummated, a fact that soon became the subject of cruel gossip across European courts. Marie-Louise, young and vibrant, was reduced to a figure of pity, trapped in a loveless bond with a man who could barely acknowledge her presence. For Mariana, the news was a dagger to the hearth. Her son, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, seemed doomed to leave no legacy, no child to carry on the line she had fought so hard to preserve. The weight of this failure pressed down on her, a crushing reminder that all her years of struggle might end in the extinction of her family's rule. The emotional climax of this period came not in a single dramatic event, but in the slow, relentless unraveling of Charles's life. Each day brought new reports of his suffering fevers that left him bedridden for weeks, digestive ailments that made every meal a gamble with death, and a mind so fragile that he often retreated into silence, staring blankly at the world around him. The court, once a place of whispered curses, now spoke openly of el hechizado, the bewitched, as if Charles's very existence was proof of some dark magic at work. Exorcisms, once performed in secret, became public spectacles, with priests chanting over the king's trembling form as incense filled the air, a desperate plea to cast out whatever demon plagued him. Mariana, though miles away, felt each of these moments as if she were there, her maternal instinct screaming to shield her child from such indignities. But she was powerless, a queen mother reduced to a spectator of her son's agony, her exile a prison as real as any dungeon. This crisis was not just personal, but national. Spain, already teetering on the brink, saw in Charles's decline a mirror of its own decay. The empire that had once dominated the world now stood on the edge of collapse, its king a living symbol of its frailty. Mariana, even in her banishment, knew that the eyes of Europe were on her son France and Austria, both with claims to the Spanish throne through marriage ties, waited like vultures for the inevitable. Every cough, every seizure, was a tick of the clock counting down to a succession crisis that could plunge the continent into war. For Mariana, the stakes could not have been higher, yet she had never felt more helpless. Her life a tapestry of sacrifice now fraying at the seams as the son she had fought for slipped further from her grasp. The twilight of the 17th century cast a long, mournful shadow over Spain, a kingdom that seemed to mirror the wasting frame of its king, Charles II. Mariana of Austria, once a young bride full of quiet resolve, had weathered decades of heartbreak and political strife, her life irrevocably tied to the fate of her son, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. By the 1680s, with Charles in his 20s, the hope that had once flickered in Mariana's heart had dimmed to a mere ember. Her exile in Toledo, imposed by Don Juan José of Austria in 1677, had been a bitter pill, but even after her return to Madrid following his death in 1679, she found no solace. The court was a hollow shell of its former grandeur, and Charles, though still king, was a figurehead at best, his body and mind too broken to wield any real power. The aftermath of Mariana's regency and Charles's decline was a story of loss, not just of a mother's dreams, but of an empire's once unshakable dominance, now crumbling under the weight of its own history. Mariana's return to Madrid did little to restore her influence. The political landscape had shifted irreversibly during her absence, with new factions and advisors circling Charles like scavengers, each eager to shape the future of a throne that seemed destined for vacancy. Mariana, though still Queen Mother, was sidelined, her counsel often ignored by a son who could barely comprehend the world around him, let alone the intricacies of governance. Charles's second marriage in 1689 to Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess chosen for her Habsburg ties, was yet another desperate attempt to secure an heir. But like his first marriage to Marie-Louise, who had died in 1689 under mysterious circumstances, this union bore no fruit. Charles's physical incapacities remained an insurmountable barrier, and the court's whispers of infertility or worse, impotence grew into a deafening roar. For Mariana of Austria, each failed hope was a fresh wound, a reminder that the dynasty she had fought to preserve was slipping through her fingers, destined to end with her son. The broader aftermath for Spain was equally grim. Under Charles's nominal reign, the empire continued its downward spiral. The economy, already battered by decades of war and mismanagement, stagnated further, with inflation and debt crippling the nation. Territories that had once been the jewels of the Spanish crown, particularly in the Americas and Europe, faced increasing threats from rival powers. France, under Louis XIV, pressed its advantage, while England and the Dutch Republic chipped away at Spanish naval dominance. The court, lacking a strong monarch, became a battleground of competing interests, with corruption and inefficiency rife among the nobility. Mariana watched helplessly as the Spain she had come to rule over as a young queen eroded, its golden age a distant memory. Her son's reign, meant to be a continuation of Habsburg glory, instead became a symbol of decline, a tragic footnote in a history once written in conquest and wealth. Charles's personal suffering, meanwhile, only deepened in the years following Mariana's return. His health, never robust, deteriorated further, with chronic illnesses leaving him bedridden for months at a time. His mental state, already fragile, descended into periods of profound confusion, where he reportedly spoke of visions and fears of bewitchment, fueling the persistent rumors of el hechizado. The clergy, ever influential, continued to perform exorcisms, their rituals a desperate attempt to explain what science could not. Mariana, now in her later years, could do little but pray by his bedside during his lucid moments, her once fierce determination replaced by a weary resignation. She had outlived her husband, her rival Don Juan José, and many of her own children, but the survival of Charles, though a blessing in her heart, came at the cost of witnessing his unending torment. Her role as mother had become a vigil, a quiet watch over a life that seemed to defy death only to prolong suffering. The legacy of Mariana and Charles II began to take shape even before their story ended. Across Europe, the Spanish succession became the burning question of the age. With no direct heir, the throne was a prize contested by the French Bourbons and the Austrian Habsburgs, each with familial claims through marriages to Charles's sisters and aunts. Mariana, aware of the storm brewing, favored the Austrian side, her loyalty to her natal family enduring despite years of suspicion from the Spanish court. But her influence over the matter was negligible. Charles, guided by advisors with their own agendas, would ultimately make the decision or have it made for him. The specter of war loomed large, a conflict that would engulf the continent in the early 18th century as the War of the Spanish Succession. Mariana's legacy, then, was not one of triumph, but of a woman caught in the crosshairs of history, her efforts to safeguard her son and dynasty overshadowed by forces beyond her control. In Spain itself, Mariana's memory became a complex tapestry. To some, she was a tragic figure, a foreign queen who bore the burden of an impossible task with dignity. Her love for Charles, a poignant counterpoint to the court's cruelty. To others, she remained a symbol of foreign interference, her Austrian roots a convenient scapegoat for Spain's woes. Charles, meanwhile, was etched into history as the Bewitched, a king whose very existence seemed to embody the decline of the Habsburgs. His physical and mental afflictions, a cautionary tale of dynastic inbreeding. Together, mother and son represented a turning point and end to an era of Spanish dominance and the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter under foreign rule. Their story, though steeped in personal tragedy, was also a mirror to a nation grappling with its own identity, its past glories fading into the dust of a changing world. As the 17th century drew to a close, the Alcazar of Madrid stood as a silent witness to a dynasty's end, its once opulent halls now echoing with the ghosts of a faded glory. Mariana of Austria, the Habsburg princess who had crossed mountains and seas to become Queen of Spain, had lived a life defined by duty, sacrifice, and an unbreakable love for her son, Charles II. She passed away on May 16, 1696, at the age of 61, her body weary from decades of struggle, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she would not live to see the final chapter of her son's tragic reign. Charles, the frail king known as El Hechizado, lingered on for a few more years, his death in 1700 marking the definitive end of the Spanish Habsburg line. Their story, though steeped in personal sorrow, is more than a tale of a mother and her cursed child. It is the story of an empire at its breaking point, a poignant reminder of the human cost of power and the relentless march of history. Mariana's life had been a series of battles, fought not with swords but with sheer will. From her arrival in Spain as a 14-year-old bride, married to her uncle Philip IV, she faced a court that viewed her as an outsider, a pawn in the intricate game of Habsburg alliances. She endured the loss of child after child, each stillbirth or early death a scar on her soul, until the birth of Charles in 1661 offered a flicker of hope, a male heir to secure the dynasty. But that hope was tainted by the reality of his frailty, his body and mind bearing the cruel imprint of generations of inbreeding. As regent after Philip's death, Mariana navigated a treacherous political landscape, fending off rivals like Don Juan José of Austria, while external threats from France and internal decay gnawed at Spain's foundations. Her exile to Toledo in 1677 was a bitter humiliation, yet even then, her thoughts remained with Charles, the son she could not save from his own body or the whispers of bewitchment that haunted his every step. Her return to Madrid offered no reprieve, only the slow agony of watching Charles's decline, his failed marriages a final blow to a lineage she had fought to preserve. Charles II's death on the 1st of November, 1700, at the age of 38, was both a release and a cataclysm. His passing, though long anticipated, unleashed the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict that would redraw the map of Europe as France and Austria vied for his throne. He left no heir, his body too broken to fulfill the most basic duty of a king, and with him died the direct line of the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty that had once ruled half the known world. His will, dictated under the influence of advisors and clergy, named Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon and grandson of Louis XIV, as his successor, a decision that tipped the balance of power and ignited years of bloodshed. For Spain, Charles's reign was a somber epitaph to its golden age, a period of decline so stark that his very name became synonymous with decay. Yet, behind the historical judgment, lies the human tragedy boy born into a role he could never fulfill, a king whose every breath was a struggle, and a son whose mother's love could not shield him from fate. Reflecting on Mariana and Charles, we see not just the fall of a dynasty, but the profound cost of power on the human spirit. Mariana's story is one of resilience in the face of impossible odds, a woman who bore the weight of an empire while cradling a child doomed by his own bloodline. Her love for Charles was her strength and her prison, binding her to a life of unending grief as she watched him suffer under the gaze of a court that saw him as a curse. Charles, in turn, was a victim of history, his body a canvas for the sins of his ancestors, his mind a shadowed realm where clarity was a fleeting guest. Together, they embody the paradox of monarchy glory and ruin intertwined, a crown that uplifts and destroys in equal measure. Their tale forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about legacy, about the price paid by those who wear the mantle of power, and about the fragility of human life beneath the weight of divine right. But their story does not end with their deaths. It lives on in the questions it raises for us today. How do we judge those who are shaped by forces beyond their control? How do we reconcile the grandeur of history with the quiet, personal tragedies it conceals? Mariana and Charles II challenge us to look beyond the cold facts of textbooks and see the beating hearts beneath the mother who refused to give up, the son who could not escape his fate. Their lives, though centuries past, resonate with timeless themes of love, loss, and the search for meaning in a world that often offers none. As we close this chapter on Spain's most cursed king and the queen who raised him, let us remember that history is not just a record of events, but a mirror to our own humanity, reflecting both our triumphs and our deepest sorrows. And now, dear viewer, it's your turn to step into this story. What do you think of Mariana's unwavering devotion? Was it her greatest strength or her ultimate downfall? How do you see Charles II, not as a historical figure, but as a person trapped by circumstance? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep this conversation alive. If this journey through Spain's darkest royal chapter has moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories that uncover the hidden heart of history. Until next time, let's ponder the legacies we inherited, the ones we leave behind.